All right. And I want to reiterate to the public, you can stay during the committee questioning or you can contact me with questions afterwards. It's up to you. All right. Let's get started. So thank you for the introduction, Dr. Rosecrans, and thank you to everybody for watching this presentation online. I appreciate your support. Dissertation purpose. The purpose of this study was to characterize injuries specific to craft brewery workers and to identify contributing factors to injury. The potential impact of this study is that the findings may be used to help practitioners who are tasked with directing intervention resources to reduce injuries among craft brewery workers. This presentation is a broad synthesis of my dissertation work. In introduction, I'll give a brief overview of the craft brewing industry and why this study was needed. I'll touch on the methods I used, and I'll highlight some key results. In implications, I will discuss how my findings apply to the craft brewing industry. What defines an American craft brewery? The Brewers Association defines a craft brewery as an operation that is independent, meaning it is predominantly owned and controlled by the brewers themselves. It has small production. By definition, a craft brewery cannot produce more than 6 million barrels of beer annually. In comparison, large breweries, such as AB InBev, which includes Anheuser-Busch, brewed more than 400 million barrels last year. Craft breweries produce beer. They hold a brewer's notice, and they brew beer using water, hops, grain, and yeast. The craft brewing industry has experienced rapid growth in the United States, including Colorado, in the past decades. This graph illustrates the recent growth in Colorado. We see time in years on the x-axis, and the dotted black line represents the number of operational craft breweries in Colorado. The blue bars represent the number of brewing licenses. Craft breweries are required to have a brewing license to function legally, so the blue bars represent potential or currently operational as well as potential craft breweries. We see that both the number of operational and potential craft breweries has steadily grown since 2010. Today, Colorado has more than 420 craft breweries, and it's estimated that 9,100 workers are employed at these facilities. The rapid growth and expansion of the craft brewing industry means that new facilities are opening and existing facilities are expanding. So what is the current state of research among craft breweries? Despite the industry growth, there are no published studies on injuries among craft brewery workers. A few studies focus on the economic impact, the environmental sustainability, and the community engagement of craft breweries, but none of these studies address the workers themselves. National injury surveillance methods do not represent craft breweries. National injury surveillance methods do not differentiate between large and craft breweries, nor do they include brew pubs. Large breweries have very different production scales, different levels of automation, and different work hazards compared to craft breweries. Injury analysis using national injury surveillance data may lead to erroneous perceptions of injuries affecting craft breweries. So with no published studies and unreliable national injury surveillance data, how can we understand the state of injuries within the craft brewing industry? Fortunately, workers' compensation data provides a solution. Employers in the United States, including Colorado, are required to provide workers' compensation insurance to cover costs associated with injuries workers may sustain on the job. For example, workers' compensation insurance covers medical expenses, disability, and lost wage compensation. In Colorado, companies with more than one employee are required to have workers' compensation insurance. Colorado companies can choose where they purchase their workers' compensation insurance, and the workers' comp process is as follows. A worker is injured on the job, then they report it to their supervisor, and they submit a first report of injury to their workers' compensation insurance provider, and that insurance company files this claim to cover injury-related costs. Now, researchers can partner with workers' compensation insurance companies to study this injury claims data, and this is exactly what I did. For my dissertation, I partnered with Colorado's largest workers' compensation insurance provider, called Pinnacle Assurance, to select claims data specific to craft breweries and brew pubs. I want to emphasize the value of this collaboration. I was able to work with Pinnacle and select claims data specifically from their craft brewery and brew pub clients. This workers' compensation injury data allows us to directly investigate injuries that occurred at craft breweries in Colorado. There are no existing injury studies, and national injury surveillance data is incomplete regarding craft breweries. So my dissertation represents the first systematic characterization of occupational injuries among craft brewery workers. The purpose of this dissertation was to characterize injuries specific to craft brewery workers and identify contributing factors to injury. In order to achieve this goal, I used 4 main specific aims. The first aim was to use workers' compensation claims data from Pinnacle Assurance to characterize the distribution and frequency of injuries among craft brewery workers. Pinnacle shared claims data specific to craft breweries that were filed and processed between July 2013 and June 2018. Specific Aim 2 focused on investigating the costs of these injuries. Specific Aim 3 investigated the distribution and costs of claims based on whether or not the injured worker was performing manual material handling tasks at the time of injury. Specific Aim 4 was a synthesis of the previous aims and injury characteristics to develop a model that illustrated how injuries can occur within the craft brewing industry. From the first report of injury filed to the workers' compensation insurance provider, I was able to investigate the distribution and costs of both injury characteristics and injured worker characteristics, specifically the injured anatomical region and body part that was affected by the injury nature. What kind of injury occurred? Was it a burn, a laceration, a sprain or strain? The injury event. What happened that resulted in injury? Examples of injury events include slips, trips, and falls, overexertion, and contact with objects and equipment. The first report of injury form also included information specific to the worker who was injured, specifically how long the worker had been employed at that establishment at the time of injury, known as tenure, and the worker's age at the time of injury. The first report of injury form also included a free response section where the injured worker and/or their supervisor could detail what exactly happened during the injury incident, and this section was called the accident narrative. From the accident narrative, I applied the revised agent-host environment epidemiologic model to identify and classify contributing factors related to the injury. This model illustrates how these contributing factors interact to create the circumstances that resulted in injury. The agent represents the energy. Injuries are a result of a transfer of energy. The host represents the injured worker's activities at the time of injury. The environment represents the physical or social space the injured worker occupied at the time of injury. And the vehicle represents the physical object that transferred the agent, the energy, to the host, the injured worker. For example, if a worker is handling kegs in a walk-in cooler and drops a keg on their foot, the environment was the walk-in cooler, the host was handling kegs, the vehicle is the keg, and the agent is mechanical energy that was transferred as the keg fell to the worker's foot. To create the injury process model, I combined information from the revised agent-host environment epidemiologic model with injury characteristics. This injury process model visualizes how all components fit together and result in an injury. Elements of the revised agent-host environment epidemiologic model are transferred through an injury event to the host's injured anatomical region, which results in the injury nature. Going back to our previous example of the worker dropping a keg, the keg is coming in contact with the worker's foot, and this is an example of the injury event contact with objects and equipment. And the foot is part of the lower limb as far as injured anatomical region, and the resulting injury nature is a contusion. I'll share highlights of the primary results and their implications. During the 5-year study period, I identified 570 claims. This represents 570 injuries that craft brewery workers reported and filed to Pinnacle Assurance. 18% of craft breweries who held workers' compensation policies and filed claims were associated with 84% of all claims. Therefore, the majority of the claims in this study came from the same few craft breweries. The majority of injured workers were male. The mean age was 32, but it ranged. The youngest worker was 18 and the oldest injured worker was 65 years old in this present study. The total amount of lost time reported in the present study was 1,297 days. But only 5% of claims, or 26 claims, reported any lost time. I investigated the costs of injuries that occurred at craft breweries. This graph illustrates the distribution of cost per claim. Cost is on the x-axis, ranging from $0 to over $50,000, and the proportion of claims is on the y-axis. We see that the majority of claims incurred costs less than $5,000. In fact, 30% of claims did not incur any workers' compensation costs or had $0 associated with them. However, in these cases, workers may have used their personal insurance rather than workers' compensation to cover associated costs. Among those that did incur costs, the median was $680, meaning 50% were associated with costs below that. And the mean was higher than the median at $2,100, and that was because some very high costs drove up the mean. Overall, cost ranged from $39 to $63,000 per claim. I also investigated injured worker tenure, how long the worker had been employed at the craft brewery at the time of injury. Here's a graph illustrating the distribution. Tenure is in years on the x-axis, and the injury count is on the y-axis. Within the present study, tenure ranged from 0 years, representing a worker who had been there for days, weeks, or months, to over 30 years. The majority of claims were among workers with less than 3 years of tenure. In fact, more than 60% of all injured workers had less than 2 years of tenure at the time of injury. So new workers experienced the majority of occupational injuries. Injury nature fell into 4 main categories in the present study. Sprains and strains and contusions were the most frequently identified injury natures, followed by lacerations and burns. 50% of claims fell into different injury natures and were collectively classified as other. While sprains and strains and contusions were the most common, sprains and strains were typically more than twice as expensive as contusions, making them the most burdensome financially, both per claim and cumulatively. I also investigated the distribution of claims by injured anatomical region. The majority of claims affected the upper limb at 43%. And lacerations, burns, and contusions were the most frequent injury natures to affect the upper limb. And the hands and fingers were the most common body parts to be injured within the upper limb. Over 30% of claims affected the trunk region, and sprains and strains and contusions were the most frequent injury natures to affect the trunk region. And the low back was the most frequently injured body part within the trunk region. The lower limb was associated with 22% of all claims in the present study. Contusions were the most commonly observed injury nature to affect the lower limb, and the knee was the most common body part to be injured within the lower limb. By analyzing the accident narratives using the revised agent-host environment epidemiologic model, I was able to identify host activity, or what the craft brewery worker was doing at the time of injury. The host activities were collapsed into 4 main activities: carrying and moving items, brewing activities, which included packaging, cleaning, and service and food preparation. The most common host activity at the time of injury was carrying or moving items at 24%, followed by brewing and packaging at 18%, food and service preparation for 14%, and 10% cleaning activities. While food and service preparation was not the most commonly identified host activity at the time of injury, I want to emphasize the importance of this data because these injuries likely occurred at brew pubs, which are not represented or captured under current national injury surveillance methods. But because of this study, we know that craft brewery workers do experience injuries while serving beer and preparing food. This is the injury process model that represents how sprains and strains typically occurred based on the accident narrative and injury data analyses. We can see from the revised agent-host environment epidemiologic model that sprains and strains typically resulted from a worker carrying an item, such as a container, which includes kegs, in the brewing or packaging area, and there was a mechanical transfer of energy during an overexertion or bodily reaction injury event that transferred the energy to their trunk, which resulted in a sprain or strain. Sprains and strains accounted for nearly 30% of all injuries in the present study, and they incurred the greatest costs cumulatively at $350,000 and had high mean and median costs per claim. The majority of sprains or strains affected claimants with less than 2 years of tenure at the time of injury, so many new hires are experiencing sprains and strains, and the majority of claimants were between 25 and 44 years old at the time of injury. I'll highlight some key findings related to injury characteristics based on if the worker was performing manual material handling tasks at the time of injury. I determined whether or not the worker was performing manual materials handling, essentially moving products, based on the accident narratives. Examples of other tasks, or not manual material handling, included cleaning, operating equipment, measuring ingredients, and cooking. Overall, fewer injuries occurred while workers performed manual material handling tasks, 29%, compared to those who were injured while doing other tasks, 71%. The proportions of contusions among workers was similar between those who performed manual material handling tasks at the time of injury compared to those performing other tasks. The proportion of sprains and strains among workers performing manual material handling tasks was 3 times higher than among workers performing other tasks. And the proportion of lacerations among workers performing other tasks was 6 times higher than among workers performing manual material handling tasks. More than half of the injuries that occurred during manual material handling affected workers' trunk region, and almost half of the injuries that occurred during other tasks affected the worker's upper limb. Cost per claim was not significantly different between injuries that occurred during manual material handling tasks or other tasks. And injuries that occurred during manual material handling tasks incurred more lost days of work, 808 days, versus injuries that occurred during other tasks, 489 days. I'd also like to highlight some key findings related to lacerations and burns. Lacerations and burns were both observed to occur in the kitchen area, with lacerations also being observed in the packaging area, think broken glass bottles, and burns in the brew house, think metal tanks. Lacerations were a result of mechanical energy, for instance, a sharp surface cutting skin, while burns were the result of either thermal energy, hot liquids, or chemical energy from caustics and acids. Injured workers were performing maintenance, cleaning, or service and food preparation activities at the time lacerations or burns occurred. And lacerations and burns similarly affected the upper limb. The cumulative cost of lacerations, $67,000, was less than that of burns at $84,000. But more lacerations occurred in the present study, 19%, compared to burns at 10%. And this indicates that burns can be very expensive. Next, I'll talk about the implications of the study per each specific aim. Recall that specific aim 1 focused on the distribution and counts of injury characteristics overall. The impact of this is that we can identify what kinds of injuries are occurring and begin to direct interventions. For example, new workers. The majority of claims affected newer workers, with 60% of claims occurring among workers with less than 2 years of tenure. Updating new hire training could improve safety and reduce injuries among new hires. The upper limb. The majority of claims affected the upper limb. Assessing workplaces for upper limb hazards could include implementing equipment modification, training, or personal protective equipment known as PPE to reduce the prevalence of upper limb injuries. Sprains and strains. The majority of injuries were classified as sprains and strains. I recommend interventions to address sprains and strains risks. This specific aim provides critical information on what the injuries are among craft brewery workers. Specific aim 2 considered the costs incurred by injuries. The impact of this aim is that it quantifies the financial burden of injuries among craft breweries. Injury costs varied in the present study. Many claims had $0 associated with them, which underestimates the true financial burden. Financial cost is a significant factor when considering interventions. The cost of injuries is helpful information for craft breweries budgeting and justifying purchases and upgrades. Sprains and strains. Sprains and strains were the most costly per claim as well as cumulatively. Thus, interventions that reduce this type of injury would likely be useful. Burns. Burns were not a common injury in the present study, but they have the potential to be very costly. Assessing craft breweries to reduce burn hazards is an opportunity for effective intervention. Specific aim 2 quantified the financial burden of injuries among craft brewery workers. Specific aim 3 combined the previous two aims, the distribution and cost of injuries, with an additional perspective. Specifically, was the worker performing manual material handling at the time of injury, and how does this change the landscape of injuries? The impact of this aim is that we can better understand what workers are doing at the time of injury, and these findings help target intervention efforts. For example, contusions. Contusions were observed to frequently occur among workers performing manual material handling tasks or other tasks. Interventions that reduce contusions would benefit all craft brewery workers. Manual material handling tasks. While injuries that occurred during manual material handling tasks were not the most common, they did account for the most lost time. So from an employee health and a craft brewery productivity perspective, it is important to investigate opportunities to reduce or revise manual material handling demands. Other tasks. In the present study, more injuries occurred while workers performed other tasks, so it's important for practitioners to not solely focus on manual material handling task areas when developing safety interventions. Specific aim 3 described both the frequency and the burden of injuries by task, manual material handling or other, among brewery workers. Specific aim 4 was where I combined elements of the previous aims with the revised agent-host environment epidemiologic model and developed an injury process model to investigate where and how injuries occur. This portion of the dissertation is where I was able to identify relationships between injury characteristics and details. The impact of characterizing injuries to this level of detail is that it provides information for targeting interventions by workplace, task demands, machinery or equipment, and worker activities. For example, sprains and strains. For specific aim 1 and 2, I identified that injuries due to sprains and strains were frequent and costly. From the injury process model, I was able to determine that sprains and strains were associated with host activities, carrying or lifting items and doing repetitive tasks. Therefore, I recommend that practitioners target work areas with repetitive motion or high lifting demands. The upper limb. All injury natures were observed to affect the upper limb. I identified lacerations, burns, contusions, and sprains and strains affecting the upper limb. I recommend interventions that focus on upper limb protection, such as design modifications and personal protective equipment. Packaging as both a host activity and an environment were associated with many injuries. I recommend interventions that assess packaging tasks for repetitive motion, lifting, and sharp edges. New hires. For specific aim 1, I identified that injuries frequently affected new hires. From specific aim 4 and the injury process model, I was able to identify that many new hires were performing low technical skill, highly manual, and repetitive packaging tasks at the time of injury. I recommend that craft breweries review and revise their new hire training to specifically address safety in packaging. I also recommend assessing packaging areas and tasks for design modifications to reduce injuries. Burns. I identified that craft brewery workers experience different kinds of burns, both chemical and thermal. I recommend that practitioners assess both chemical cleaners as well as thermal hazards, such as uninsulated pipes, to reduce burn hazards. Lacerations. Lacerations occurred where the injured worker's upper limb contacted sharp glass or metal. I recommend interventions that address machine guards, training, or personal protective equipment in the packaging and kitchen areas. In the kitchen, injuries occurred in the kitchen and service area. If a craft brewery has a restaurant and kitchen or plans to add one, I recommend that they implement training and personal protective equipment to reduce the risk of burns and lacerations. In this dissertation, I used workers' compensation injury data to develop and apply the injury process model to characterize injuries among craft brewery workers in Colorado. This injury process model helps identify who is getting injured, how they are getting injured, and where. Before you can fix a problem, you have to know the scope of the problem. This model is a tool that health and safety practitioners can use to identify how and where injuries occur in craft breweries, and with this knowledge, they can be cost-effective by directing site-specific interventions. When a worker is injured on the job, that injury can impact their livelihoods and their lifestyles. Findings from this study can have lasting effects to reduce injuries and improve the quality of work life among craft brewery workers. Thank you for watching. While we don't have time for public questions now, please feel free to stick around or email me with questions. And thank you to everybody who helped with this project.
Thanks.